Here we have our beautiful wooden fence anchored on a concrete driveway. It has wooden slats and a wooden frame which are mounted on steel poles which are anchored into concrete. And we're going to open up here, and the reason I built it was this right here, our mini split compressor worth quite a bit. I didn't want it to be visible from the street, so I built this fence. Let's come on in and check it out. Alright, so in order to build a fence on concrete, the magic happens here with these things called wedge anchors. That's the bolts you see right here, in this case 4 of them on this particular fence post. I used 4 posts for my fence assembly, so I needed 16 wedge anchors. And the way they work is you first get a hammer drill, either buy one or rent one, they're not too expensive either way. You drill a hole into concrete a little longer than the actual wedge anchor, and then you clean out that hole, get the concrete dust out of there, and then put this wedge anchor into the hole and put a washer, or first you put your fence post on, then you put a washer over the fence post flange, and then you put a nut over the washer and you tighten up the assembly, and the bottom part of these wedge anchors expands into the concrete, and when they expand they fix the wedge anchor and by following the entire fence post into place. And you just got to give these things about 2 or 3 turns with a crescent wrench and you're good to go. Wedge anchors run maybe $1.50 to $2 a piece, and hammer drills you can rent them for about 40 or 50 bucks, or buy one for maybe 100 bucks. Before you insert any wedge anchors at all, make sure you measure once, twice, 3 times exactly where you want your fence posts to go, because once you install those wedge anchors, it's darn near impossible to get them out. They're pretty fixed in place. Once you get the fence posts mounted though, your fence isn't going anywhere. So that's a good thing. It's very secure, it's very sturdy. Also, before you mount any fence posts, consider widths. Consider the width of the fixed pieces of the fence on either side of the gates. And you also want to take in consideration of the gate widths also. You want your gates wide enough to get, in our case, a trailer through, or narrow enough for security. That's a personal preference. Once you get the widths figured out and the fence posts mounted though, you can start putting slats in place after you mount the frames. Measure the widths of the fixed pieces of your fence as well as the gates so that you don't have to customize any of the slats. You don't have to cut them to be narrower or somehow make them wider. You want to just be able to screw them into place and you're done. So the next thing we want to do is build a frame. We want to build a frame for each swinging fence gate. These particular frames have cross pieces at an angle, as you can see here, and the key to the strength of these frames, the key to keeping your fence gates straight and warp free, is building them with interlocking corners. So here's a close-up of the corner, and each corner is going to have an interlocking assembly, and we're going to get to that next, and I'm going to show you how to build those assemblies. And also here you can see a close-up of the wheels, and there's also a fixed piece underneath each frame where the wheels mount onto, and you can see a close-up of the bolts that hold the wheel assemblies in place. And of course you can see that the wheel assemblies have miniature shock absorbers built into them. I'm going to measure up the 2x4s for the frames, and then I'm going to use a circular saw to cut the notched edges. We're going to set our circular saw base at about 7/8 inches. That will get us about halfway into the thickness of the 2x4. As you can see right here, the teeth are just about at the halfway point, and that means we're going to have 2 interlocking 2x4 ends at each corner, and we want them to be the same thickness, the same depth of cuts, so they interlock nicely. And here we're just going to gently pry off all the pieces that we cut with our circular saw they'll pretty much pull off with ease. This is pine, so you don't need to do a lot to get the pieces, to get the gaps removed. I'm just using a chisel here to get a little bit of a finer, smoother surface. It doesn't have to be really, really smooth, just smooth enough to get a nice interlock. That's key to have a nice, straight, square fence. Now we've got the frame assembled, and I put the slats on the frame, but I'm showing you right here, I used two about 1.5 inch wood screws per corner, and you can see the corners, how they interlock really nicely, and that's key. You want to make sure the wood butts up against itself, that each 2x4 butts up against each other 2x4 in each corner. So you've got a nice, straight, square, solid frame. That way you're going to have less warping, if any warping at all. And you're going to have a nice looking fence, and the next thing to do is build a cross brace. So let's get started on that. Here's the assembled gate. That one's already put in place, and you can see it looks pretty good. I'm going to come around here and show the cross piece that's already in place on this particular gate. We're going to build one here. I decided to build a complete fence gate on one side before starting the fence gate on the other side. I just felt like it would be easier to do it that way. You can do what you want, but I just figured if I had one gate done, it would be easier to set up the other gate. Now I've got the second gate in place, and I'm going to get started on the cross brace. So I'm just going to mark the angles right here. I'm going to use a ballpoint pen because that gets a better, like a fine-tuned point to cut at. Come around and mark the other side, and then we're just going to use our C-clamps and put the cross piece that we're going to cut in place, and I'm going to use a circular saw to cut these angled areas right here. Now that I've made those cuts, I'm going to go ahead and use my pocket hole jig to make a pocket hole for each end of the cross piece. And I used these clamps to hold this pocket jig in place. Get that pocket jig finished, and I'm using one pocket hole on each end of the cross piece, along with a wood screw set at an angle. So let's remove these clamps, and you can see the pocket jig hole that's going to be used to fasten the cross piece in place, and that's going to give this fence gate an extra degree of stability and keep things straight, keep it from warping. Here I'm going to use a second wood screw along with the pocket jig screw to really hold that cross piece in place. I'm going to do this on each end, by the way, and you've really got to torque that guy in there. You're going to have to set your power drill at serious torque to really get it in there. I'm using a 2.5 inch wood screw here. Okay, before you hang either fence gate, you want to build a little support piece for the wheel assembly. And what I'm doing here is I'm taking a piece of scrap 2x4, it's about 6 inches long, and I'm cutting a notch on the bottom with my reciprocating saw. And that notch gives the wheel clearance to turn. And once that notch is cut out, then I can mount it with bolts onto the bottom of each gate. So I'm going to need 2 of these little supports for the wheel assemblies. Now I'm getting ready to hang the second gate. I'm using scrap pieces of tile to prop that fence gate up in place, and I'm using a piece of scrap plywood here to give it gap away from the fixed part of the fence. Those hinges are not attached to the fixed part of the fence. They're only attached to the swinging gate so far. Now we're going to go ahead and drill the hinges in. I'm just going to drill 1 or 2 screws on each side in, make sure I've got the fence gate positioned exactly the way I want it, make sure it's straight. Speaking of wheel assemblies, I use 3-inch long carriage bolts. I use 2 of these carriage bolts per wheel assembly. And those wheel assemblies I had to find online. I couldn't find them at the big box stores. Those are nice wheel assemblies. They have built-in shock absorbers, and they give a lot of movement for each fence gate. As a finishing touch, put a lock mechanism on the gate. I mean, that's what the whole thing is for, is security. So, and you can see with the wheel assemblies, these gates, despite their size and weight, swing out very easily, and they give you lots of room, lots of clearance, and they cover up an ugly end of a driveway like we have here. Yeah, that's not the prettiest sight in the world, but closing the fence makes things a lot better looking. And you lock it on the other side and you take off for the day, and you know everything behind that fence is secure. Thanks for watching this video. Hope it helped you. Subscribe if you liked this and my other videos.